Nigel passed the rest of the day in various and not very interesting ways. His holiday was proving rather flat, largely owing to the fact that there were now so few people in Oxford whom he knew, whilst those he had met since his arrival were not only occupied with their job for most of the day, but got on so badly with one another that their company was generally anything but agreeable. If it hadn't been for Helen, he would probably have packed up and gone back to London straight away. He anticipated seeing Nicholas at lunch, but he'd unexpectedly left Oxford and did not return until the next day. A walk round his old haunts, taken in the hope of its producing a few pleasant frissons of remembrance, proved barren, and when the sky became overcast and a thin, persistent drizzle set in, he gave it up in disgust and went to the pictures. After a late dinner, he sat gloomily reading in the lounge of a hotel until it was time to go and meet Helen. Their supper party succeeded in cheering him up a good deal. The rumour of her affair with Richard, to which Nigel led up with elephantine tact, Helen dismissed as quite baseless, and accused Nigel of being an innocent if he imagined that that sort of remark, coming from Uziette, had any relation to fact. As they strolled back together to Helen's rooms, Nigel waxed sentimental, in terms which it is not necessary to speak of here, and he went home so happy we must suppose they were not ill-received. The next day, the day of Peter Graham's eventful party, brought with it belated imitation of summer warmth, which lasted until the end of the week. Peter Graham, who had spent Tuesday in dancing incessant and thoroughly inconvenient attendance on Rachel, devoted most of the whole of it to agitated preparations. In the morning, Nigel found him in the bar, laden with flowers and trying to cadge a couple of extra bottles of gin out of the barman. "Cherries! I must have some cherries, and olives! Nigel!" He rushed Nigel away to the shops to buy a great quantity of unnecessary and expensive things for the party. Within its limits, as Nigel afterwards admitted, it was a good party. There were unpleasantnesses, but he observed them through an agreeable alcoholic mist, and in any case he became so used to unpleasantness during the past few days that he would have felt uneasy if none had occurred. The final incident, however, if something could be called an incident which passed completely unnoticed, did, in fact, disturb him. He spent the earlier part of the evening at the theatre, watching a play in which a number of men and women committed a complex series of adulteries without any evident relish, to an accompaniment of Gurgeon comment and cocktail glasses. He took some pleasure, however, in watching Uziette, and rather more of a different kind in watching Helen, and was somewhat irritated to find that he felt extremely possessive and proud whenever she came on stage. He had to suppress a desire to nudge his neighbours and win from them a similar approval. But the trivialities of the plot so wearied him that he slipped out before the end. He went home with hardly more than a thought as to how it would end. Doubtless they all succumbed to nervous disease. In consequence, he arrived a little early at Peter Graham's room to find that only Nicholas was there before him, comfortably settled in a corner and showing little inclination to move before the end of the party. Peter had certainly contrived an extraordinary display of bottles and glasses, and stood with a proprietorial air in the middle of them all, urging Nicholas rather unnecessarily to drink as much as he could before the others arrived. Nigel was astonished, though, at how sober Nicholas remained throughout the evening. On reflection, he could not remember ever having seen anyone drink so much with so little effect. After he had been there about 10 minutes, Robert and Rachel came in to be greeted by Peter Graham with enthusiastic cries. A little later, 2 army officers, acquaintances of Peter's, also arrived, and later still a considerable contingent from the theatre, in 2s and 3s. "You asked us to invite a lot of people," said Robert, "and I think most of the company is coming. Except Clive, who's gone up to town to see his wife." The marital preoccupations of Clive were beginning to prey on his mind. Jean, Uziette, Helen, and Donald Fellows all arrived together with a motley collection of hangers-on from the theatre. A semblance, at any rate, of good feeling existed between them, though as the evening wore on, Nigel noticed no real change in the situation. If anything, matters seemed to be worse. Richard, a tall, fair-haired young man in his late 20s, was there, and so was Jane, the stage manager. Nigel observed with some amusement a tendency on the part of Peter to gravitate away from Rachel towards Jane, a manoeuvre he accomplished rather clumsily, but Rachel was certainly more relieved than annoyed. The stage of polite conversation soon passed, and a horrible gaiety set in. Fragments of speech were lifted high above a communal babble. "Oh, Jane, dear, you are a slut! Chekhov, I assure you, began the disintegration of the drama by disintegrating the hero. So I said, in my opinion, you should play the whole Othello in just one green spot. I wanted to do the Wycherley in modern dress, but the Lord Chamberlain stepped in. Diana, where's Diana? You see that awful boy over there? Well, my dear, don't let it go any further, but I feel sick. Bit hearty, some of these people, aren't they? I really do feel awfully sick. Well, go outside, then. I just wish I didn't feel so sick. Nicholas sat immovably in his corner, talking to Richard about Berkeley and metaphysics. Whenever one of the younger women came near, he beckoned her solemnly over and kissed her, equally solemnly, on the lips, and then dismissed her with an airy wave of his hand, and continued the conversation. Donald Fellows was sulking on his own. Usiette was attached to Robert. "Darling, you must be nice to me this evening, you must. Please don't spoil the party for me, Robert, darling. Please, darling." She was already very drunk. Nigel sought out Helen early in the evening, and with a few breaks stayed with her till the end. The row and the heat of the room were beginning to give him a headache. There was a good deal of horseplay going on, and he'd no wish to become involved in that. He looked at his watch. He'd already been there 2 hours. He suggested to Helen that they should go. "In a minute, darling. I must look after Usiette. She'll never get home on her own." Nigel looked for Usiette, and was alarmed to see her in the middle of a large group, waving a heavy army revolver. "Look what I've found! Look what little me's found!" Now, Usiette, dear," Peter Graham elbowed his way through the group. "You'd better give me that. Damn dangerous, you know." "Nonsense, not dangerous. Hasn't got any bullets in it." "Well, all the same, old girl, you'd better let me have it. You never know what could happen." He took it away from her more or less by force. "Now, we'll put it away in the drawer with the cartridges, and we'll forget all about it. There." "You beast!" Usiette suddenly turned on him and tried to claw viciously at his face with her long nails. Now, he managed to catch hold of her arms. "You can't have that sort of thing, you know. We're all friends here." "Let me go, you great lout!" "Oh, Robert, darling, did you see what that swine did to me, darling? He tried to molest me, darling. Oh, knock him down for me. If you're a man, go knock him down, the swine." Robert, actually embarrassed, tried to detach her arms, but she was so far gone she would have dropped if he let her go. Helen went across. "Come on, Usiette, we're going now. Hang on to me." "It's all right, I can manage. Good night, everyone. Thank you, Peter, for a lovely party." Nigel followed to see if he could help. He met them coming out of the lavatory. Usiette pale, sweating and shivering. Helen flushed with sudden embarrassment when she saw him. "Here, let me help." "No, thanks, Nigel, I can manage. You go back and enjoy yourself." Nonetheless, he went with them to the door of the hotel. "Good night, darling. If this doesn't cure me of going to parties, nothing will." It was pretty beastly, wasn't it? "You sure you can manage?" "Yes, it's not far. Look, Usiette's not bad, you know. Just silly." A slight smile lit up her face. On an impulse he went up to her and pressed her hand. Usiette, clinging to her arm, was mumbling inanely, "God bless you, my very dearest." And they were gone. When he got upstairs again, the party was already beginning to break up. The guests had gone down the stairs in twos and threes, yawning and chattering. Nigel found Rachel standing by herself, while Robert gave Jean some instructions for the next morning. "How dare that girl make a fool of Robert like that? In front of everybody." "Oh, nobody blames Robert. Why should they? It's not his fault." "I don't think he's altogether averse to having her hanging on to him." "Well, surely you don't think—" "Robert's like all other men. Any change is a change for the better. But if he or she imagines I'm going to sit by and play the tolerant—" She stopped abruptly. Nigel felt acutely uncomfortable. Another thread, he thought. This situation is certainly getting unpleasantly complicated. After the farrago of good nights, Nigel and Nicholas found themselves alone with Peter Graham. The amount of drink he had had suddenly took effect in an unexpected manner, and while they were still talking to him, he collapsed into a chair and began to snore profoundly. Nicholas sighed. "Now I suppose we shall have to put him to bed." This, with some difficulty, they accomplished. When they came out into the sitting-room again, Nicholas looked about him in disgust at the empty bottles, dirty glasses, flowers scattered or broken, furniture disarranged, a blue haze of cigarette smoke, and innumerable cigarette stubs, more or less concentrated round ashtrays. "What a filthy mess this place is! I pity the poor devil who's got to clear it up. Ah, well, bed, I suppose." Nigel followed. When they were out in the corridor, Nicholas said, "Oh, Lord, I've got a foul headache. If I don't get some fresh air, I shall never sleep. I'm going out for a stroll. What about you?" No, thanks. If I want any fresh air, I shall stick my head out of a window." "Ah, right you are. But mind the blackout. By the way, what was that Rachel was saying before she left? I thought I heard some strictures on our admirable sex." "The usual paean in praise of Yuziet." "Oh, Rachel hates that girl. The cool, sensible woman pose wouldn't deceive a babe. She loathes her." "Is it a pose?" "Well, who knows? I think it is, anyway. Men are all the same. Any change is a change for the better. Well, isn't that so? Any change, however good, is a change for the worse. You mark my words. Anyway, enough of this chatter. Good night to ye." He went off downstairs, and Nigel returned to his room and began to undress. In the long corridors of the hotel, the main lights had long been extinguished. Only a few pale, widely spaced glimmers remained. Peter Graham groaned and turned uneasily in his sleep. In the big entrance hall, lit only by a single bulb in the roof, the night porter dozed uncomfortably in his box, and so failed to see either the person who flitted silently up the big staircase to Peter Graham's room, or what that person was carrying on its return. The swing doors creaked a little, and the night porter half woke, but, seeing nobody, dozed again. In his bedroom, Nigel dropped a collar stud under the dressing-table. Damn! He was inexplicably uneasy. Something was crying out to be investigated. Cool reason told him to forget it and go to bed, but an irrational fear and premonition proved to be stronger than cool reason. "This is a damn silly wild-goose chase," he said as he slipped on his dressing-gown. But 2 minutes later he was opening the door of Peter Graham's sitting-room. He switched on the light. Nothing was different. The haze of cigarette smoke still hanging about, the ash remained as it had been, trodden into the carpet. Cursing himself for a superstitious fool, he went softly over to the drawer where the revolver had been put. His scalp tingled unpleasantly as he opened it and looked in. The drawer was empty. Revolver and cartridges were gone. He closed it again, and on a sudden wild impulse wiped the handle where he had touched it with a corner of his dressing-gown. Then he went over to the bedroom door and pushed it ajar. A shaft of light cut into the darkness beyond, and from the room came the heavy breathing of one who sleeps deeply. He closed the door softly and went back to his own room. Nigel slept only fitfully that night. For long stages at a time he was awake, smoking and thinking over what he'd discovered. Nicholas, whose room was next to Nigel's, returned late and made what Nigel thought an unnecessary amount of noise getting to bed. But that was the least of his worries. In itself there was nothing so particularly disturbing about the disappearance of the gun, which might have been taken as a joke, or might, for all he knew, have been lent by Peter Graham to someone at the party. Yet he had watched them all leave, and he could have sworn nobody had it hidden on their person. It was a heavy, bulky thing, a Colt 38. The only conclusion he could come to then was not a pleasant one. Someone had slipped back and taken it. Could it be Nicholas? He seemed the most likely person, but anyone could have done it. He rose and breakfasted early, wondering as he did so what the more riotous members of the party must be feeling like. Then at 9:30 he went to his room to get a book. His way led him through the corridor where Robert and Rachel's rooms were situated. It made him a party to a coincidence which afterwards proved to have been of some considerable importance. As he passed Rachel's room, she came out on her way down to breakfast, and it was at that precise moment that Uziette emerged from Robert's room opposite. All three of them stopped dead, and to Nigel at any rate the implications of Uziette's presence were obvious. To say that he was astonished would have been the wildest understatement. He was very nearly stupefied. It was unbelievable that Robert had slept with Uziette that night, particularly in view of her condition when Helen took her home. But what else could one think? Rachel apparently of the same opinion, and the expression on her face was not pleasant to see. Besides, Uziette's appearance shocked Nigel. She was slovenly dressed in a blouse and slacks, carrying a bag and a thin red notebook, and in her eyes was an expression of mingled fear and satisfaction, which was repellent to a degree. They looked at each other in silence for a moment. Then Uziette, with a slight sneer, went off downstairs. Not a word had been spoken. Rachel made to go into Robert's room, but Nigel caught her arm. "Is that wise?" After an almost imperceptible pause, she nodded and followed Uziette slowly downstairs. Nigel went on to his room, frankly bewildered. The whole business was inconceivable. Troilus's words came unbidden to his mind. "O madness of discourse, that cause sets up with and against itself! Bifold authority, where reason can revolt without perdition, and loss assume all reason without revolt." Of course it was none of his business. Of course it was nothing to make a hell of a fuss about, and yet speculation refused to be quieted in him. An unformed fear hovered persistently at the back of his consciousness. It was with difficulty that he persuaded himself to think of other things. When he next saw Uziette, he had been sitting in the bar since 10 o'clock with Robert, talking rather awkwardly about indifferent things. About 10:10, Donald Fellows had come in, deposited an armful of organ music on top of a radiator, and joined them. He was not pleasant company that morning. In fact, he seemed to have relapsed into a permanent state of sullenness. He very ostentatiously directed his conversation towards Nigel, an attitude which succeeded in making Robert, who 2 days ago would have considered it merely amusing, extremely irritable. And since he talked mainly about music, a subject of which Nigel knew little and wished to know even less, conversation soon became merely sporadic all round. All three of them refused obstinately to refer to personal matters, which precluded more than a few vaguely conventional remarks about the previous night's party, and Donald was obviously suffering from a hangover. The rehearsal that morning was not until 11 o'clock. After the first rehearsal, Nigel had not been to the theatre, and felt on the whole disinclined to do so before, at any rate, the dress rehearsal. "We shall have an hour's break for lunch this morning," Robert said, "then go through the afternoon. Would you tell Helen I'd be glad to see her if she cares to lunch with me?" said Nigel. "I shall be in the lounge from about 12 o'clock onwards." "Helen? Yes, by all means." It was then that Uziette entered the bar. She was dressed as untidily as when Nigel had seen her that morning, and still carried her bag and her notebook. He saw that as she came in, an expression of black anger appeared on Robert's face, and he half started up from his chair. Then relaxed and sat back, looking extremely uncomfortable. "He's probably afraid she'll hang about his neck in public and make the whole thing obvious with a lot of dreary innuendos." Which is exactly what she will do, of course. Uziette met Robert's eyes with a look in which triumph and defiance were oddly mingled. She flung down her things and swaggered to the bar. None of the three men moved to get her a drink, but she watched them closely as she ordered brandy, and then walked back with it. "Well, my children, how are you all feeling after last night's carouse? Poor Donald, you look a bit green." "I think it would be more appropriate for us to ask you that question," Nigel said dryly. "Was I very tight last night? Well, one's only young once, as the dreary cliché has it." I went to your room this morning, Robert dear. I was so sorry not to find you in. I'm afraid when dear Nigel saw me coming out, he thought the most dreadful things. And Rachel as well. Such a pity I had to run into her. I thought I was being so discreet." She picked up her glass with a shaky hand and swallowed half the contents at a gulp. "Still, I found what I went in for." "I'm delighted," said Robert. "And, as you say, what a pity I missed you." "Never mind, darling." "Oh, God," thought Nigel. "Of course," Robert went on, "I shan't see you at rehearsal today, but as I imagine there's something you'd like to talk to me about, perhaps—" "I, darling? Nothing in the world. You sound so conspiratorial, doesn't he, Nigel? As though he wants to slip me a cheque for blackmail. Oh, if you do, I'm sure the others wouldn't mind. But, of course, I'm not accepting any cheques or doing any blackmail. Do you know, it's so unwise, blackmail. Much, much, much better that the truth should be known." "What are you talking about, Yuziet?" demanded Donald. "Nothing, darling. Only a joke." "Well, I've got to go now." "Must you, Donald? Are you going to practice your organ? You play it so nicely." Donald rose and picked up his music, and then stood looking at her for a moment. Then, with a brusque movement, he turned on his heel and went. What a sweet boy. He's a tiny bit gauche, but you can't have everything, can you? Let me get you both another drink. What are you having, rye and dry? Come to the bar with me, Nigel, and help me carry them back." On the way to the bar, Yuziet continued to look back over her shoulder and smiled at Robert. Arrived there, she propped herself up with her back to it and left Nigel to do the ordering. Unfortunately, just as the barman was giving Nigel Yuziet's brandy, it slipped from his fingers and spilt on the bar. He hurriedly pulled her away, but he was not in time to prevent some of it running onto her blouse. "Blast you, clumsy fool! For God's sake, give me a handkerchief to wipe it off." "Yes, here, I'm so sorry." But to be honest, Nigel couldn't find much remorse at the incident. He ordered another brandy while she scrubbed ineffectually at the cloth. He suddenly felt extremely ill, no doubt a belated after-effect of the party, and very, very weary of Yuziet, and everyone who had anything to do with her. A fit of morose irritability seized him. "I wish to God they'd all go and hang themselves," he thought. They went back to Robert with the drinks, for which Yuziet had conveniently forgotten to pay, and Nigel saw her take a swift look about her, and then stiffen and flush furiously. She looked at Robert with eyes so full of hatred that tears sprang into them against her will. She literally threw her drink onto the table, snatched up her bag, and left. There was genuine bewilderment on Robert's face. "Well, for heaven's sake! What on earth—" Nigel grunted and sat down. Good riddance. He swallowed a double whisky, neat. Not unnaturally, this made him feel even more sick than ever, and he was relieved when Rachel came in and he could decently excuse himself, because obviously she wanted to talk to Robert alone. The conversation was perfunctory until he rose to go. "Oh, you won't forget my message to Helen." "Message? No, of course I will. I won't forget, Goodbye, then." "Arrivederci." "Arrivederci." Rachel gave him a ghost of a smile. "Hypocritical farewells," he said savagely to himself as he pushed through the swing doors into the street and made for St. Christopher's. "I should be delighted if I never saw any of them again. Let them all squabble their beastly heads off. Let them shoot each other with stolen revolvers. I'm damned if I shall care. But they wouldn't have the guts to do that. It's all superficial and conventional and merely stupid. They wouldn't have the guts." But he was wrong. For now, on the borders of the mind, the jackals and hyenas went back to their lairs, and soft-footed wolves began to stalk, in circles that grew ever narrower, towards a point where they fell upon a struggling, screaming form, and silenced it. The bickering and squabbling became transmuted by a sudden hidden alchemy into physical terror and physical agony and violent death. That afternoon Nigel left Oxford and returned to London. He came back the following evening and heard a shot. When he next saw Yuziet, she was dead.